for sure. I'm done running from my past.
Yeah, I'd say the one that was most intimidating, or that I was worried about the most, was the descent sequence in the third act of how to shoot skydiving, free fall, that aspect, and have it feel real and tactile, and personal. Which was one of Kate's big things with all of the characters, was staying intimate with each of the characters, not having us just be washed away in the spectacle that happens in the MCU often. So I think there was that was probably the biggest sequence that I was concerned about, to have it be grounded. And I think Dave and the team did an exemplary job of executing it and keeping it energetic, dealing with all the twists and turns that we throw at them with the edit changes and all of that, so that you end up being with the characters in this ridiculous free fall. And then I'd probably say on with that is the hardest shots in those are probably the close-ups. It's not necessarily those massive wides, it's those ones where you're in close and the background's defocused and the energy doesn't feel right, and then you just keep changing the background and you're trying to figure out how to make those work. Even though those blue screen elements were shot outside on, robot arm, and you did everything you possibly could with the performers, those were always the ones that were the hardest, I felt, to finish and get to the point where everyone was happy. Over those big, massive wide shots that, took, forever to render, and, hundreds of assets in them. And, so I think that was probably the biggest or most sequence that I struggled with the most, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, those close-ups work so well because they give some emotion to the scene, but you do have to decide, I assume, like, are we trying to shoot out in natural light? Are we shooting against blue screen? Are we doing something else? I don't think virtual production was a major part of the production there, but tell me about those considerations, how to shoot those close-ups.
It was, so I'd worked on Iron Man 3 a number of years ago, which had free fall sequence as well. And so I was really adamant and wanted to shoot an actual stunties skydiving to try to replicate as much as possible, because there's a visceral energy that you get out of that with regards to camera movement, character motion. So even if you rotomate the characters, you track the camera and you throw everything else away, you still get something from that effort. So we had that, and we also had a large wind tunnel that they built out at Pinewood to try to help blend the gap between the performers and the real free fall. So that was another piece that we had tech-wise that we were working with. And then robot arms were the last piece, where we would have either Yelena or Natasha kind of attached to a robot arm where we could move them around or camera around them. So those were the ways that we were, so we had the real free fall, we had CG, we had the wind tunnel, and then we had robot arm / wire work that we did with them. So there was a logistical challenge of trying to make all of those pieces work between main unit and then second unit as well, and in a descent unit that did the free fall. So just trying to get the story in place enough to execute it that way to shoot something, let alone have the edit that works in post. And I think even if we'd had the tech to do LED screens at that point, we probably wouldn't have leaned in that direction, just due to the time frame and the prep that's required to get that content onto those screens. And probably also just due to the amount of light, or the ambient light, that you would get from being exterior in the sky surrounded by these clouds. And I'm sure that's evolving as far as how much light output we're getting from these LED screens, and that's continuing to evolve. And we did shoot everything outside, to try to maintain that exposure, those exposure values. So that was kind of the leading going into it. And then basically all the pieces were post-viz and smashed together to try to help develop the story that then Dave and Digital Domain executed from there.
Adding the complexity to it all, right? Because there's a lot of flat surfaces and materials. So you're adding visual complexity, both with the amount of geometry, the type of textures, the lighting, and then getting everything to work at the correct scale. It turns out, I didn't know this before, if you model a beautiful cloud and you have it close to camera, it looks great, and you push it out a couple miles from where you want to render it, it looks like a blob. And so because they're so fractally, so a lot of it's just kind of layering in, getting the kind of the choreography of this, getting the atmosphere right, the atmospherics, the scale of the noise on the clouds, or the fractal part of it, and getting the geometry. And then again, the sims have to have the detail in it to maintain that scale throughout and kind of give that sense of how big the world is.
Yes, because I was thinking in that sequence, you're trying to tell the story of this fight that's happening while they're plummeting. I don't know, how fast does a skydiver go? Were there moments where you tried to stay very physically correct to that at all? Or is it just really making sure storytelling beats are told?
I think we do our best to kind of ground it in what it would do. And usually you very quickly just kind of deviate from that, right? But you at least have your baseline. You're like, okay, it sounds silly, but if we have a skydiver going, right, you'll just have either usually the first version, you'll see a ball falling beside it at what the speed they're supposed to be falling, and it'll just shoot by them like in one frame, or it'd be a motion blur or whatever. But you just want to know what that's supposed to be. And then a lot of it's driven by the sims around it, right? Like you need those sims or the falling debris and all the breaking apart to kind of read and be able to see it and have the fire and the smoke trails and all of that. So in a lot of ways, the simulations kind of dictate how fast we're actually falling to give that sense of speed, but also be able to read all the simulations.
Make her suffer.
I don't want to hurt you. You don't want to hurt me.
I would probably point you to the fight in Dracov's office with all the widows. And you know, it's not always technical difficulties, but the complexities of everything that has to fall together to get to the shot and the impression that Kate wanted it's just a lot of things that have to play together, and that you can't really cheat through, because it's a dozen, you know, widows all dressed in black on a set that you have to layer all this atmosphere into, the CG atmosphere into. So you can't start to cheat, or you immediately, you know, lose edges or lose, you know, spatial understanding, and then the fight falls apart. So, you know, you have to match animate every character, you have to roto every character, you have to do this layer of atmosphere, and then you introduce the red projection through it. So then you introduce this really artistic aspect to it that, again, wants to play into the psychological intent of the shots. So, you know, you have this very technical aspect of getting everything to play together, and then this very artistic one of what widows in the fight can you know, partially obscure with this red light, and where even in the frame psychologically do you want to be intense light and color. It becomes this whole thing while you're trying to still tell the story and understandable action of the fight. It becomes this whole recipe that where every shot becomes intensely studied and psychologically, you know, manipulated.
Yep.
It's not just assembling a sequence anymore.
I was thinking about that sequence too. I wasn't sure if I asked you last time what kind of on-set lighting, and Jeff, you can jump in on this as well, I suppose. You know, there's that big red projection, of course, which is more like a hologram, but I wondered whether you literally had like an LED or light panel of red or something, and were you beholden to that lighting, or could you change things a little?
So we had on the day, we did have a red projector that was projecting an image or a map that Kate had chosen, just to give us some interactive. Now that did evolve and change, and I'm sure there was moments when Craig was probably cursing that projector that we had there on the day. But I'm sure there were potentially other times that it helped to give a little bit of ambient into the room, just because having that light source there does change the lighting of the room. So I think there is an aspect of probably curses and praise that were given to that piece. But there's definitely a balance in that. Like it was something that was going through my mind while we were shooting that sequence. Is this hurting us or helping us? And we know what Kate wants, but is this putting us into a corner? And also knowing, it's a Marvel film, so there's a chance that things might change. Interactive light's always a scary thing. So to me, that was kind of bouncing back and forth through my mind. But Craig, I don't know what you're.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it helped quite a bit. And the thing that we got out of it more than anything was projected lines on the actors' suits. So, there was something real that was moving with the actors correctly on their fabric. And, whether that matched up to our final map, which it didn't, you couldn't tell because, it was just graphic elements. And we had the laser lines showing up in the CG atmosphere that connected to major bits on their suits, but for the most part, there was so much action and kind of flow through it that you got away with a lot. And having that anchored on their suits just kind of let you have a little bit more freedom in what you could do through the air.